Welcome to the latest edition of Hadiyun, BICOM's weekly podcast. I'm Richard Pater, the director of BICOM in Israel. I'm delighted to be joined by Calev the director of research, who is back home in Israel as well.
Thanks, Richard.
We're also joined on the line with Celine Touboul, who is the Deputy Director General of the Economic Cooperation Foundation. The ECF is an Israeli think tank focused on Israeli-Palestinian relations and regional stability. Celine, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Hello, thank you.
I suppose most pointedly, since we last recorded a podcast last week, we had a significant round of violence over the weekend with close to 200 rockets and mortars being fired by Hamas onto southern Israel. So my first question really for you, Celine, is another round of a major round of conflict between Israel and Hamas inevitable?
Well, I don't think it is inevitable, but for sure, if all the players currently involved continue to act as they've done in the last 2 years, the war in Gaza is indeed just a question of time, I think. And I think the risk of a war is caused by three main factors. The lack of a clear ceasefire arrangement that define clearly what are the rules of the game, and the commitments of each side in regard to the ceasefire, the acute financial and humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and the dead end in the internal Palestinian reconciliation. And unless we address these challenges by a different policy, I think there is a lot of chance that we will face another war pretty soon in Gaza.
So what do you think? What can we do to avoid that scenario?
First, if we're looking at what we are doing now, currently, and I will focus first on Israel, okay, that currently each side is reacting to what it interprets as the other side crossing a red line and act in order to test the limits of the other side's tolerance in an attempt to enlarge its own room of maneuvers. And in this context, Israel is mainly acting by means of deterrence to prevent Hamas to increase its military capacity, but it does so also while trying not to harm too much Hamas in order to preserve Hamas' capacity to enforce the ceasefire and not to risk that there will be a total vacuum and chaos in Gaza. But it has not really defined what its objective and the way it wants to address the current situation. And there is a significant gap between the military and the political level in that context, while the military level in Israel has internalized the fact that in order to achieve stability, we need to address the economic distress in Gaza, and while the political level is mainly resting on its military power in order to address the current challenge in Gaza. But I think that if we want to avoid a war, and I think it's feasible, Israel needs to define a comprehensive strategy that will support and actively encourage the Palestinian Authority to return. And I'm aware that it's not easy because the Palestinian Authority is currently very reluctant to take responsibilities in Gaza. But we haven't tried genuinely and seriously enough to incentivize the Palestinian Authority to do so. So to define a policy which would include significant alleviation of the current restriction at crossing, but not only, also political incentives. And so to define, let's say, a menu of measures, to do that in coordination with the Egyptians, to do that in coordination with the Americans and with other significant donors that are currently involved in Gaza, and to define a contingency plan if indeed, in spite of all these efforts, the PA continued to be reluctant.
Thank you. And just one final question. We've spoken on previous weeks about the impending arrival of some grand bargain and some deal being presented by the U.S. administration. Do you think anything on that nature is possible, or even a long-term truce between Israel and Hamas? And what are the conditions for that need to be met?
First, we had to differentiate between what the US have tried to do, which is not that clear, and the idea of what maybe you mean by a grand bargain, meaning some kind of understanding with Hamas. I don't think that this is what the Americans have in mind. I think that the Americans have tried to find a solution for Gaza that will not involve neither the PA nor Hamas, involving the private sector, list of projects, nothing that, in my view, is substantial enough and realistic enough to create a significant change in Gaza. And I don't think that you can have a policy in Gaza that involves none of these players. Now, this is quite different from the idea of having an understanding between Israel and Hamas, what has been dubbed as a Hudna, kind of long ceasefire arrangement between Israel and Hamas, which in my view is problematic for two main reasons. First, I don't think that Israel has really tried to engage with the Palestinian Authority for them to be involved more significantly in Gaza, trying to support them positively in that respect and reassure them that such strategy of an Israel-Hamas understanding will be really harmful to the objective of the two-state solution and will contribute to deepen the divide between the West Bank and Gaza. This is, from my point of view, the first main problem with that approach. The second problem is that I don't think it will actually address some of the challenges that we are currently facing in Gaza in regard to, first, Gaza financial crisis, the fact that a large portion of the population today does not get a salary, whether we are talking about the 55,000 employees of the PA that have seen their salary cut significantly in the last year, and even more so in the last month, and the 43,000 civilian employees of Hamas that also don't get salary. And the fact that these people don't get the salary is, I think, one of the main causes of the current instability and the current crisis that we are facing in Gaza. And I don't see how an understanding between Israel and Hamas will actually solve that issue, basically because the PA will be even more hostile to Gaza than it is today, so we can expect more sanctions from them. Second reason, because unlike such deal will include Israel forwarding taxes, incomes that it collects on behalf of the PA, that it will reverse them to the Hamas, which I don't think is something that Israel will consider. The bottom line is that I think it's failed to address some of the current challenge. The other one being also the current water and electricity crisis in Gaza, which is mainly due to the governance vacuum that is currently existing in Gaza, and that will not be addressed by a deal between Israel and Hamas that will mainly focus on the terms of a ceasefire, I think. Now, the question also that we need to ask ourselves is what Israel will be willing to put on the table in such an understanding. Because if we want Hamas to commit to a long-term ceasefire, Israel will have to put serious things on the table. Now, why not to put these things in the context of the PA turning to Gaza? I think that this should be the equation.
Fascinating. Celine, thank you very much indeed for your time. We very much appreciate you joining us this afternoon.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Calev, what do you think was the most pertinent aspect of what Celine had to say? What's your assessment?
I thought what was particularly interesting was Celine's focus on the importance of the PA, of the Palestinian Authority, and its role in Gaza. I think ever since the more or less failure of Palestinian reconciliation and that process and Abbas's sanctions against Gaza, etc., I feel like the chances of the PA coming back to Gaza in any sort of form are quite small. And I think because of that, even though it's far from ideal, a lot of people who are discussing some sort of alleviation of the humanitarian situation in Gaza have been focusing on something that does not include the PA. But I think Celine makes a very important point that the PA is the international interlocutor, it's Israel's partner, it's the international community's partner, and any agreement that excludes the PA would be very, very significant. The problem really is that if you look at the triangular relationship between Israel, the PA, and Hamas, so Israel's relationship with the PA, Israel's relationship with Hamas, and the PA's relationship with Hamas, all three are really in a particularly low point. And that in some ways makes any sort of agreement very difficult. And I think that also relates to something that Celine said, which is that in some ways what the Americans are trying to do is they're trying to make an agreement both without the PA and without Hamas. And that is also unlikely to succeed. But really where we get to is wherever we look, we are lacking a kind of a serious, responsible, legitimate address, either amongst the Palestinians or specifically in Gaza, with which to make some sort of agreement. Rich, I wanted to ask you, there's been a lot of analysis over the past few days about the violence over the weekend and how the two sides are kind of itching closer towards war. But I think my perspective is that we're not in a significantly different situation to where we were this time last week. What's your perspective on that and also on what we've heard so far today?
Well, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I think the strategic situation hasn't changed significantly, even in the last 3 months. If you remember, the analysis that we put out at the end of March talked about the strategic distress of Gaza, and that's largely remained the same. What has changed is the tactical issues that they've had traction, not necessarily with the marches and the attempts to infiltrate, but this phenomena of the flying firebombs, the incendiary balloons and kites and even condoms, as ridiculous as it sounds, is posing a major challenge of how you deal with this. And the thousands or tens of thousands of acres on the Israeli side is not a reality that Israel is prepared to live with. However, you then find yourself in the scenario where, as the IDF have made very clear, you don't go to war over kites and balloons. So the IDF is very clear that this is a tactical issue that they need to deal with in a specific pinpointed manner and targeting this specific problem, but not enough to take in and lead to a larger invasion and a significant deterioration or acceleration in the violence. The problem, as you suggest, is that after the last weekend, we may find ourselves there anyway. The marginal for error on either side, leading to casualties from hundreds of rockets that Hamas and Islamic Jihad have fired, and the potential for Israel that targets at the moment infrastructure targets, but not personnel. The margins for an error and calculated error is sadly all too real. It's fascinating to listen to the leaked debate within the security cabinet from earlier this week, where you had certain ministers pushing for a harder line action, and whilst the IDF, as we said, pushed back and explained that they would not order attacks on these people flying kites, but instead are stuck with sending warning fire against these cells.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we've discussed this before, but I think for me what's interesting is a strategic decision over whether to engage in a conflict with Hamas is in some ways based on whether a mortar or a balloon with explosives lands in one place in a kindergarten or 5 meters to the left and leads to casualties. And it's that margin of error, which in many ways is just accidental, which has very strategic consequences.
That's interesting, but I wanted to make one more point that is reflected in the Israeli analysis here, that suggests that the calculus of Hamas has changed. That it's not only that the IDF will not tolerate the fire and will respond, but likewise Hamas will also respond in rocket fire for those responses of the IDF. And that's led to some analysts here concluding that Israel really needs to take a very tough posturing and show the credibility of the threat, that they are prepared to ratchet it up and to really go significantly harder on Hamas. And we saw the examples of Iron Domes being moved into the center of the country in preparation for potential longer range rockets fired from Gaza. We saw this military exercise that ran a drill for occupying or invading Gaza in a substantial sense, although the IDF were clearly quick to point out that this was on the schedule, on the books already months ago, but in a kind of convenient timing for psychological warfare, it was able to make announcements about this to show their readiness. But the IDF needs to show this readiness, to show that they're the Hamas, that they're serious, in order that the situation actually doesn't escalate. So there is a real paradox there.
Well, I'd go even further in terms of the paradox. At the moment that Israel publicly states that it has no interest in toppling the Hamas government, suddenly the leverage that Israel has over Hamas in terms of its deterrence becomes a lot weaker. So in some ways there's two levels going on. There's a level of rhetoric where you need to convince the other side that you're willing to go the whole way, and if you are able to do that, then on the military level, often you don't need to go as far as you might have needed to go otherwise.
If we can just change tack for a moment, and let me ask you, I mean, we saw this at the beginning of this week, this historic summit in Helsinki between President Trump and Putin. What do you think are the ramifications for Israel, I suppose, regarding the northern border as a result of that summit?
And this is something that we've discussed many times on this podcast, that Israel has got several red lines or several aims, and some of them are accepted by Russia, and others aren't. And I think that was reflected in some ways in what came out of the agreement, that Russia and the US are on Israel's side in terms of moving Iranian presence and proxies away from the border in the south. They are not prepared or willing or able to get Iran out of the entirety of Syria. But I think what came out of Netanyahu's meeting with Putin, and in certain ways was then verified by the Putin-Trump thing, was that even though Russia isn't willing or able to push Iran out of Syria, it won't stand in Israel's way if Israel wants to try and do it, as long as Israel doesn't undermine the Assad regime, and as long as it doesn't put Russian troops in danger. I think that's one of the things that was crystallized over the past week. What were your thoughts about the consequences of the summit?
Well, I mean, we don't have a full readout, obviously, what the most interesting part of what happened in the room. But similar to you, I think the fact that Israel, and the credit to Prime Minister Netanyahu, has been able to maneuver himself to be able to guarantee that freedom of action is a huge strategic gain for Israel in all the uncertainties of what is yet to come. The fact that he allows himself to do that is very substantial. And in the bigger picture as well, that the fact that the US and Russia meet and they are both having a very regular and deep and meaningful dialogue with the Israeli government is to Israel's credit, that they're able to be able to dance at two weddings, so to speak, and know your place and be able to communicate and articulate their concerns to the greater regional and world powers. Well, thanks, Calev, and I think we'll leave it there for now, but we will continue this conversation in the days ahead, no doubt. Thank you.